Good morning again. Whether you're new to faith or checking things out for the first time or have been trying to be a Christ follower for years and years and years, we all find ourselves, in a sense, on a road trip. And we all like the open road. Most of us do. Just imagine you're in your dream car. You have your favorite playlist. You have good coffee. Greg Allen, not Dunkin' Donuts. He's got a shirt on this morning he had to show me. But you got good coffee, good friends with you. Maybe some of those people are even family members. And you're just heading out on the open road. And life is sweet, and it's just a great experience. And most of us hope that life kind of unfolds that way or travels that way. And that we're on a good road trip and that things are going well. But every once in a while we find ourselves in seasons where it isn't going so well. Where we, quote-unquote, get flat tires on the side of the road, or we wonder if we're traveling in the right direction. We actually ask ourselves, or it echoes in our mind, in our heart, and our soul, where in the world is my life heading? And then sometimes there's other people in our life who actually ask that question for us. We kind of feel it's okay. We're not really watching life that observantly, but somebody else brings it in and says, where is your life heading? Or they say to you, I think you're traveling in the wrong direction. And then we try to respond to that. Sometimes I think we feel like John Candy in this scene.
Hey! Hey!
Hey, what's going on?
Some joker wants to race.
Race? That's ridiculous.
You're going the wrong way! What? You're going the wrong way!
He says we're going the wrong way.
How would he know where we're going?
Yeah, how would he know? Thank you. Thanks a lot. Terrific.
Thank you!
Some of you drive with people like that, and you've had to take your claws out of the dashboard. And it's funny, we are on a road trip, our life is on a road trip, and we're zipping down the road, and sometimes we're not aware that we're going in the wrong direction, we're going the wrong way, and somebody nicely or not so nicely tries to share it with us, and we try to just kind of ignore it and keep going that way. But when we're thinking about road trip and we're thinking about direction in life, last week we started with our exit 1, and today's exit 2, are we there yet? But we started with this idea is where is your life heading, and that we need to have a baseline, and that baseline involves needing to know what God's direction is for our lives. And there's some things that we need to know. We talked about 2 last week. We started off by looking at Jesus' words, and Jesus actually uses road trip language in Matthew 13 and 14 when he says this, "Don't look for shortcuts, for the wide exit has a broad road which leads to disaster. And there are many people going that way. Last week, as we looked at this, we really wrestled with the understanding that that includes Christ followers too. There are times where we take shortcuts, and in a sense, our life is heading towards disaster. It's heading in a direction that is dangerous, and we many times just don't want to hear it. And we say, thank you, and just keep going along the road. But small is the exit and narrow the road that leads to life. Only a few are finding it. And we find that even true in Christ follower circles. It's just not people that aren't following Christ. We find that sometimes it's us, but sometimes we can see it real apparent in somebody else's life that they're just not finding it. And that idea of not finding it is they really don't want to find it. They don't want to hear about it. They just want to keep barreling down the road and going the direction they're going. They don't want to hear that their way is wrong. I sometimes don't want to hear that my direction, my outlook is wrong. I don't want to hear that. It seems to be natural in most of our lives that when anyone speaks into our lives, even when they're nice about it and gentle about it, most of us aren't like, thank you. Well, we might say thank you because we're polite, but inside we're not thanking that person. And so Jesus says only a few are finding and only a few are living it, because the direction to life, to God, is vigorous and requires total attention. We live in a day and age of distracted drivers, and more we're hearing of the danger of that. Well, we've lived in a day of distracted Christ followers for longer than the last couple years. That goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And we have to ask ourselves, what direction are we going? And usually it's in those places where we ask, where is my life heading? Because we're dealing with heartache or some of the consequences of that. And we realize that we've got to be full on. This following Christ isn't a side dish. It isn't a part-time hobby. And for a lot of us, we might not ever say it's a part-time hobby, but if we really looked at our lives, we do this Christ thing half-time. There's dangers for all of us. Even as a pastor, I can do the Christ thing, the Christ-following life, half-time. I can have all the external mechanisms, and it looks like I'm following and all in, but maybe I'm not. And that's just to ask that question. So the direction to life, to God, is vigorous and requires total attention. So we talked about two things last week. We're just going to hit them really quickly. Just a reminder that life, God's direction, is more like a GPS than a triptychs. GPS blueprint kind of idea, or it's more like a game plan where there's some flexibility. We'll give you a definition in a second for that. Than a triptych, which is very exact, or a blueprint that's really exact. Sometimes we get into this situation where we ask what's God's direction, God's will for us, and we can boil it all the way down to what color shirt I pick out this morning to wear to church. And was I supposed to wear the red one, the white one, and of course, I see lots of orange today, so it obviously should have been the orange shirt today. Now people looking around, I didn't get the memo, but they did. But how exact is it? But really, it's more of a game plan. It's more of a GPS where the trip unfolds and you make changes along the way. Rather than spending or spelling out everything in detail, it sets forth general guidelines and principles with lots of freedom and flexibility for adjustments as life unfolds. And I've told you that, on my GPS, sometimes it has one plan, and then somehow it knows there's a traffic jam, and it says, get off this exit, save yourself 5 minutes, and get back on here. And sometimes I follow, and sometimes I don't. But I find the times I follow it, usually it's helping me out in a good way. There's some flexibility to that. We also discovered that it's more about how we live than where we live. Sometimes we get so hung up in the blueprint. I need to do exactly this. I need to marry exactly this person. I need to be here, be there, be there. And what happens is we live in a life of panic and anxiety, where God, I think, is more concerned about how you're living, where you're living, than where. And a lot of us, it's all about where. It's all about the next step, and we're forgetting about today and how I'm living. It's not that those things don't matter. It doesn't mean that every once in a while God does give us a specific thing, item, whatever. But it seems that, at least in my mind, I spend more time worrying about the where than thinking about today and how I live. And we're going to find today that when we really focus on the how, the where, the what comes a lot easier. We looked at Paul's words, and Paul's words kind of sum this kind of concept up when we see in Romans 8:28. It says, that's why we can be sure that every detail in our lives of love for God is worked into something good. In other words, when we're really engaged in this, when we're doing it full time, even those of us who are full time engaged in our walk with God are still not going to make perfect decisions. I didn't wear my orange shirt today. Not a perfect decision. I guess. We're not going to make perfect decisions. The only one who made perfect decisions was Jesus. So what God does when our heart is in the right place, and I said last week that it doesn't mean that we have sloppy living and we play games with it, but when my genuine desire is to follow Him, and I do that, and I'm living a life of love for God, that God somehow steps in supernaturally and amplifies that decision and makes it go farther than it ever would have gone. It has a greater impact. Some of you have had those experiences. You've been in a conversation and you're trying to come alongside somebody and they're hurting and they're looking for wisdom. And you say these things and you go, that wasn't really good. And all of a sudden you see that it blossoms in their life. And it's really God came alongside your good intention, your life of love, and amplified it. And makes it into something good. And so because of that, at least a nice relief for me was this, the bottom line for last week, the takeaway was, do your honest best and then take a rest. That we could actually rest. So when you really throw yourself wholeheartedly into this thing called following Christ, and there's a decision, and there's an action, and there's a behavior, and maybe there's a don't do this, or wherever you're at, that once you've gotten to that place, you can actually rest. You can say, it's going to be okay. Because the world doesn't function just on what Dave Spencer does. It's actually God. So I do my best, I do my honest best, and then I can relax a little. I can rest a little. I told you a story about our jade plant that's 29 years old. And people come in and go, wow, nice jade plant. And they think Dave Spencer has a green thumb, or Cindy. And Cindy maybe, but Dave doesn't have a green thumb. And they go, wow, look at that. What they don't realize is that every 3 to 5 years, this jade plant gets really sorry looking. I mean, I do water it, and I do turn it, so the sun. But it gets really bad looking, and it goes to Massachusetts to recovery time. And my dad takes it. And my dad has had it at least 3 or 4 times over the last 29 years, and it's looking really sorry, and he brings it back, and there it is. You see, we have a dad, a heavenly dad, that does the same thing to our lives. Whatever that situation is, we're watering it, we're turning it the way we're supposed to be. We really don't have the abilities, the wow for this moment, and somehow then God steps in, our heavenly dad, and makes it look like that. Happens all the time. You probably give examples of that. So if you want to catch up, that's just kind of like where we were last week, what we were talking about, and just trying to understand, what it means to understand God's directions in our lives. So when you and I get to the place that we're ready to think about God's direction in our life, and we answer those questions. Another question we start sometimes thinking about is, are we there yet? And those of us who have kids, those of us who have been kids, all know about that famous statement, are we there yet? And sometimes that statement's sweet and nice like this.
Are we there yet? 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 Are we there yet?
not there yet. Almost.
Isn't that so sweet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Where are we going? You see, usually when we ask that question, where is my life heading? What direction? Very quickly after that we ask, are we there yet? We ask that as adults too, don't we? There's things unfolding in our life. We're trying to maybe navigate the road and are on a road trip. We're trying to follow God. We're trying to follow His direction. And we're trying to see certain things happen in our hearts and in our minds or whatever. And we start asking very quickly, once we got that direction, are we there yet? But for most of us, it isn't that cute little girl in the back seat. For most of us, this is kind of like our experience.
Are we there yet?
No.
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 Are we there yet? Are we there yet?
You little...
Homer, I think we're there.
That's maybe my car, not the sweet little, And so it goes from this innocent, are we there yet, to we're just going crazy with asking this question, are we there yet? We know where we're going, and we want to be there. And the thing is, when we're trying to understand God's direction, we need to realize that there's a process involved in this. There's a process. We're not instantly there yet. There's a process as we walk through this. And really, when we're trying to understand God's will in our life, we need to realize that it's more like an old school Kodak instant picture. You remember those cameras? And somebody was at a wedding yesterday and said they were back. They're coming back. Now it's the new rage to have these little cameras and you do your thing. I haven't seen one of the newer ones, and out comes a new picture, and you watch it materialize right before your eyes. And that was instant back then. It still seems a little slow, but that was instant back then. And, really when it comes to God's will, sometimes it's easier to see His will in the rearview mirror than in front, on the front windshield, because as we're moving towards, as we're going through it, it still has to materialize. It still has to unfold. Some of you may have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to instant pictures, but here's a little commercial from back in the 70s.
The instant camera you've been waiting for, instant color photographs, that's what the handle's for. So carry on, let yourself go.
Grab onto the handle at a low price for dry, self-timing color pictures that happen in minutes, right before your eyes.
Grab onto the handle and carry on.
The Handle, Kodak's newest and lowest priced instant camera.
Any of you under the age of 35 now understand why your parents are the way they are. This is the commercials we used to watch. And that's the way some of us dress, not all of us. But anyway, so, this idea that understanding God's will is more like understanding an old school Polaroid or a Kodak instant camera, where it slowly unfolds. Some of them, when they first came out, you used to have to shake them a little bit and look at them. And when they first started materializing, you go, what is that? Do I have this right? And, you'd see a shadow in there. And then the first thing you'd look, if you were in the picture, was see if your hair was okay. But then, you'd look at what's going on. But it would take a little bit of time to figure that out. And if you had one of these cameras, you never wanted to waste this film because it was like unbelievably expensive. And so you were like, just look at one, see how it came out, see if you need to take another one. And so when we really are looking at God's direction in our life, when we're looking at a road trip, we need to understand that there's this process that, in a sense, materializes what, from our perspective, is very slow right before our eyes. And it starts materializing, and we start to have to understand that. And some of the things that we need to realize to be a part of this process, to be moving in this process, is first of all, is that today's direction brings tomorrow's direction. And this really comes back maybe even to that not where but how idea. Today's direction brings tomorrow's direction. And at least in my life, I'm much more concerned about tomorrow, next week, 3 months from now, than actually today. I can ignore today's direction, but still want tomorrow's direction. I get them out of order. Last week we talked about God's Word being a light unto our feet, enough light to take that next step. But a lot of us want to see way down the road, not just the next steps. And so I've shared this before. I can remember as a youth pastor having a college-bound students agonizing over what college to go to because they were looking at God's will, God's direction being blueprint. If they went to the wrong school, they would set things in motion for the rest of their life. It would be always plan B and be off. And they were fearful of that. And somewhere in the conversation, gently, nicely, depending on how I knew them too, I'd finally say, so how are you following God today? How is your walk with God today? How was it last week? And many of them say, well, I really haven't, I said yes to Jesus when I was a kid, but really haven't done too much with it. And I said, well, that's good that you've said yes to Jesus, but where is your relationship with him? Well, it's really non-existent. I really haven't thought a lot about it until this college decision. And I would, again, try to say as nicely as possible, I'd say, this decision about college would be easier, not easier, but it would be easier if you had some history of walking with God for the last at least few weeks, the last month. And we giggle about that, but sometimes you and I as adults may have a good knowledge about God, but our relationship with God is There's a lot of static on the line, and a lot of that static on the line is because of our interactions. We haven't paid that much of attention. And then something huge comes up. Hey, I can sell my house, I want to move here. A new job. A decision. And then we get into this place that we're making decisions, trying to follow God's direction, and we're kind of floating out there a little bit because we don't have 2 or 3 weeks or a month or 6 months or maybe a year of really walking with him. So when it comes to making that decision, we're in a sense flying by the seat of our pants. And it's not the best decision because of that. Now, I do want to say God can be gracious and step in and help you make a good decision. But it would be easier. I'm going to get myself in big trouble now. I would have an easier job getting a Christmas present for Cindy if I was listening to Cindy 3 months before Christmas rather than a day before. What do you want? Sometimes we do that to the Lord. It's the moment. It's the moment for reckoning, the big decision, I need you working in my life, God. And first breath is, what do you want? And then you go, this is what I want. And again, God doesn't get caught up with all the pettiness of that kind of thing. We do as human beings, but he doesn't. But at the same time, we don't hear his voice as clearly. It's just common sense. I love what Solomon writes in Proverbs, Proverbs 4:18, page 440. You can find that in the Bible around you. Also, we'll have it up on the screen. If you don't happen to have your own copy of God's Word, please feel free to take that Bible around you as a gift from Seneca Community Church. Also, Love You version. I can download that on your smart device. But Proverbs 4:18, you remember Solomon, wisest man who ever lives, writes these proverbs for his son, who's going to be the next king. Most of them are written by him, and the son obviously wasn't listening because he loses the kingdom. That's a whole other story. But we read this in verse 18. The path of the righteous is like the morning sun, shining ever brighter till the full light of day. And this doesn't mean, path of righteous doesn't mean perfect. It basically just says, what path are you on? And if most of us stopped and thought, we could make a pretty good educated guess, maybe more than a guess, with a little time with God, and say what kind of path I'm on. Am I moving towards God? Am I moving away from God? Because there's really no neutral. So if I'm moving towards God, if I'm taking steps towards God, I'm on the path of righteousness. If my relationship is growing, I'm on the path of righteousness. And what Solomon says, it's like the morning sun, and it shines and gets brighter and brighter and brighter to the full light of day. And all of us have been in those places. Maybe it's more camping. You ever got into a campsite late at night and it's super dark and you do have your headlights to your car, or you're backpacking and you just have a headlamp, and you get into the site, you try to find where to set up your tent, and you're setting it up in the dark, and you have no idea where you are. And then the next morning you wake up early and it's a little bit of sun, a little bit more sun, and all of a sudden you start to see where you are, and sometimes that's really great, and sometimes that's not so great, but let's just say it was a great morning. As the sun gets up, and all of a sudden you see all the beauty around you, go, wow, this is a great sight. But it took time for the sun to come up and get brighter. And the same thing is true with us when it comes to today's direction, today's instruction, and a lot of those instructions are not rocket science. Some of those instructions are just be nice to people. Don't think of yourself. Don't eat the last donut. I don't know what it is in your house, but whatever it may be, eat the orange popsicle instead of the raspberry one. Guilty, So, because I hate the orange popsicles. So, but whatever that may be, those basic things in life, and do those instructions, respond to that, and guess what? God's direction in your life gets brighter and brighter and brighter. Sometimes over a week, sometimes over a month. But I would hope if you're really trying to grow in this relationship with God, our church wants to lead people in that direction. If that's happening, you actually have more light for direction than you did a year ago. I hope that's true. I hope you're not in the same place a year later. I hope the light just hasn't gotten to set. I've got these dimmers, and I can actually set them as percentages on my phone. It's really cool. Very nerdy, 15%, okay, not 16, not 40, 15%. And I stop them at 15% because I'm also trying to save electricity. I hope that light isn't stuck at 15 or 20, and it's not been at 20 for now a couple years. And what's hard for us in church world is we can know more about God than we did 2 years ago, but really not know God any better than we did 2 years ago. But we let that light. We follow those instructions. So today's instructions bring forth tomorrow's instructions. Also, there's this idea that there's a what and a when. There's a what and a when. When it comes to God's instructions, when it comes to God's direction, we discover the what, but we also have to understand the when. There are times where we know the what, but it's not time for it. We could look at Moses, and I'm not going to read through all of this, but Moses knew the what. He knew that he was to lead. Verse 25 of this passage says, Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. This is 40 years before he comes back. And it's interesting, he gets into the situation and he thinks the when is now. And he acts. He kills someone. He defends his people. But for some reason it wasn't the when. He knew the what. And I've always read this and thought this, the wilderness was great and all that kind of thing. He learned how to shepherd, and I think that's true. But I also read this a little different this week. What if he knew the timing wasn't then and didn't kill that guy? What would happen if he had lived the next 40 years in the palace? Could his leadership skills been in a whole different direction? You see, he knew the what, but he didn't understand the when. So when we come to these daily decisions that lead into the next and the next and the next, we may very clearly understand our capacities, who God's making us to be, and we understand the what, but we can be very careless and not understand the when. King David was a man, before he became king, that understood the what and the when. He was anointed to be king. That was the what. He had at least 2 opportunities to take the kingdom, but it wasn't the right when. And I think the reason he knew that is because his relationship with God was growing day after day after day. It was very mundane, very boring, but day after day after day after day, he was taking steps towards God rather than away or just staying in neutral. You see, he knew the what. Jesus, if you read the life of Jesus in the Gospels, the four first books of the Newer Testament, you'll see that there are these moments where the people want to take him and make him king. There's times where he backs off a little bit so that the Pharisees won't move against him and maybe kill him prematurely. He knows the what, but he knows the when. And you only know the difference when you're walking closely with God. It's easy sometimes to discover the what, but it's hard to hold on to the when. And in a few moments, we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper because he knew the what and knew when. Let's move along a little bit here. Part of this, when and what, is if you have to do wrong to accomplish what is right, it isn't right. Seems so obvious. But how many times have I experienced somebody who does wrong to accomplish right, and it just makes things worse? I'm sure no one in this room has personally done that, but I can think of a time, once maybe 2 times, where I knew the what, but I'd used wrong techniques to accomplish something that was right, and it wasn't right. Blew up in my face. Sometimes we can manipulate people. We know they should be in a certain direction, and we use techniques that are not right, and it gets worse. So don't use wrong. And I'm going to say, be hard on yourself. Is this wrong? Might be. Then, if it might be, then wait a little bit longer. Wait a little longer. See if it flips from it might be to no, it's not. But sometimes we're so impatient to do what we want to do, and we can even see it has the hand of God on the long-term result, that we rush it, and we use wrong things to, in theory, accomplish right things. Also, if it's going to hurt your spouse or your kids, it's going to hurt. There have been times in my life where I knew a what, but I knew the when was not now, because it would have hurt my wife or my spouse. My wife or my kids. And even though I knew that was the what, there's a lot of folks out here who see where God's leading, see God's direction, but they don't stop to ask, is it going to hurt their kids, their family? I know there was a time where I was working on my graduate school and I wanted to extend it out as long as possible. Just kidding, but yes, I did want to extend it. But seriously, there was this time where I was hitting it hard. We changed churches, and it was a new church, and there was new things going on. There was some problems going on, and I put my graduate school on purpose on hold for 2 or 3 years. Because I thought, I knew the what. I knew that God wanted me to finish that degree, even though I really didn't want to, but I knew He wanted to. I knew the what. But it wasn't the right when. I needed to be more engaged with the move. I needed to be more engaged at the church I was at. I couldn't be distracted with schoolwork, and so I had to put it off for 2 or 3 years. So now I'm playing catch-up all these years. I did get the degree, but probably now I'd have like 3 or 4 doctorates if I had waited. So I'm always going to be running behind. Just kidding. But that's okay to put your life on hold when it's a what, when the when isn't right, when it's going to hurt your kids and hurt your spouse. Also, if it ignores wise counsel, it's probably ignorant. Wow, that sounds strong words, but I had to have ignores, ignorant, you get the idea. But if it ignores wise counsel, probably ignorant. Now, there are some times, not many, what did I say? Not many, where you go against wise counsel. And there's been maybe 2 or 3 times in my life where everybody around me has said, I wouldn't go down that road, I wouldn't do that. And I said, I really think God wants me to do it. That's going to expose you. That's going to be, you're going to be vulnerable if you do that. You may come back to haunt you. No, I think I need to do that. And I have. And a couple of those things definitely were the right thing to do. Probably. But if you look at your life and take the last 20 decisions you've made, and you think you got the handle on wisdom, and everybody that's important in your world says, no, every time, I think you might be being ignorant. Or you don't have wise counsel. But if you have wise counsel, you follow their lead. There has been times in my life where I've wanted to take a certain step, and I've had wise friends who say, don't take that step. And we've prayed about it, and I've talked about it, and I've said to them, because I want to put some weight on them, I've said, I'm going to listen to your counsel. So you better be before God. You better be before God. Because if you're just making this off the top of your head, I'm going to adjust my life according to what you say to me. So we're in this together. And they said, no, I wouldn't do that. And I submitted to their wise counsel. When was the last time you submitted to someone else's wise counsel? I guarantee you could give me some times where you just blew it off and didn't listen. But when was the last time? We all want God's direction in our life. And let me say this, and you honestly shared the scenario. Because I've gotten good at this. I'm sure none of you have gotten good at it. I can actually paint a scenario, explain a scenario, and get the answer I want most times. I'm sure you can't do it. I can paint this, that's why we all do this and do that. And they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. Well, of course it makes sense the way I said it. So honest explanation of example. So you're shortcutting the wise counsel. Today's instructions for tomorrow. Also, we need to realize that potholes don't mean you missed a turn. Potholes don't mean you missed a turn. When life gets rough, sometimes that's a part of going in God's direction. I've met people who like to wear their pothole experiences like a badge on their, their sleeve, their chest, I'm suffering for Jesus. I'm not talking about that, but real potholes. When it gets going, one quick example from Paul. For we came into Macedonia, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn. Conflicts on the outside, fears within, but God who comforts the downcast comforted us. Those were potholes. So don't just chuck up God's direction in your life when it gets going a little bit tough, when you hit some potholes. That may just be a part of the deal. This isn't heaven. This isn't a perfect world. And we have hardship. So don't throw up. And it's interesting that in this case, Paul goes on to say, comfort us by the coming of Titus. So, there's potholes in life. But I also want to throw this out there. I hope you can be a Titus. When someone's following God's direction, as best as you know, that you comfort them and help them and strengthen them. And Titus was that to Paul. The idea, again, of comforting them. This whole question, if I'm going in the right direction, this whole idea, are we there yet? We paint that with a negative thing, but when it comes to God's direction, when it comes to walking in that journey, when it comes to that road trip, actually think, are we there yet, can actually have a flip and actually can be a positive thing. And Porsche Car Company got this right when they did this commercial.
It's a question that's as old as the very first road. It's been asked of parents in every language the world has ever known.
C'est bicho da? احنا وصلنا خلاص؟ Ya llegamos? Are we there yet?
And it always yearns for the same answer. Unless, of course, it comes from the back of a Porsche.
Don't worry, we have a long way to go.
I want those kids. Oh, we have a long way to go. Oh, I want that wife. Oh, yeah, I want that Porsche. But anyway. Sometimes we're so bent on the destination, the where, that we miss out on enjoying the how. Even in the pothole roads, sometimes it's the greatest thing to watch God step up and step in to that situation and kind of carry us along the way. It's just a delight to have that happen. So our thought for the day is this. Let's be today what we need to be today, to be where we hope to be tomorrow. You have to think about this. Let's be today what we need to be, so that to be where we hope to be tomorrow. And God's direction in our life, the road trip in our life, in some ways, can be as simple as that. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for your leading in our life. You don't just set us on this journey, this road trip, and leave us by ourselves. And Father, I pray for the person here that is trying to figure out what that even means, that as they hear these things, as they interact with other people, that it become clearer and clearer to them that you can be a part of their lives, that you can give them a road trip, a direction in life that helps them just understand where they're heading. And I pray for those of us who have been on the road trip for a little while. I pray that you would renew our focus, renew our understanding of what it means to be on this road trip, that we would actually enjoy the road trip. It wouldn't just be about, are we there yet? And I know some of us are thinking about heaven, and that's fantastic. Are we there yet? But just maybe, we have a little bit more work to do on this road trip. And so help us to enjoy the trip that we're on. I just thank you for your love for us, and thank you for moments like these. In Jesus' name, amen.